Section 13 of T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Moon of Rochester, New York. T. de Witt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas de Witt Talmage, Milestone 8, Part 1. I reached the 50th year of my life in December 1883. In my long residence in Brooklyn, I had found it to be the healthiest city in the world. It had always been a good place to live in. Plenty of fresh air blowing up from the sea, plenty of water rolling down through our reservoirs, the Sabbaths too quiet to attract ruffianism. Of all the men I have seen and heard and known, there were but a few deep friendships that I depended upon. In February 1884, I lost one of these by the decease of Thomas Kinsella, a Brooklyn man of public affairs, of singular patriotism and local pride. Years ago, when I was roughly set upon by ecclesiastical assailants, he gave one wide swing of his editorial scimitar, which helped much in their ultimate annihilation. My acquaintance with him was slight at the time, and I did not ask him to help me. I can more easily forget a wrong done to me than I can forget a kindness. He was charitable to many who never knew of it. By reason of my profession, there came to me many stories of distress and want, and it was always Mr. Kinsella's hand that was open to befriend the suffering. Bitter in his editorial antagonisms, he was wide in his charities. One did not have to knock at many iron gates to reach his sympathies. Mr. Kinsella died of overwork, from the toils of years that taxed his strength. None but those who have been behind the scenes can appreciate the energies that are required in making up a great daily newspaper. Its demands for copy come with such regularity. Newspaper writers must produce just so much, whether they feel like it or not. There is no newspaper vacation. So the commanders-in-chief of the great dailies often die of overwork. Henry J. Raymond died that way. Samuel Bowles, Horace Greeley. Once in a while there are surviving veterans like Thurlow Weed or Erastus Brooks or James Watson Webb, but they shifted the most of the burden on others as they grew old. Success in any calling requires drudgery, sacrifice, push, and tug, but especially so in the ranks of the newspaper armies. A great many of us, however, about this time survived a worse fate, though how we did it is still a mystery of the period. We discovered in the spring of 1884 that we had been eating and drinking things not to be mentioned. Honest old-fashioned butter had melted and run out of the world. Instead of it, we had trichinosis in all styles served up morning and evening, all the evils of the food creation set before us in raw shape or done up in puddings, pies, and gravies. The average hotel hash was innocent merriment compared to our adulterated butter. The candies which we had bought for our children under a chemical analysis were found to be crystallized disease. Lozenges were of red lead. Coffees and teas were so adulterated that we felt like Charles Lamb, who in a similar predicament said, "If this be coffee, give me tea, and if it be tea, give me coffee." Even our medicines were so craftily adulterated that they were sure to kill. There was alum in our bread, chalk in our milk, glass in our sugar, Venetian red in our cocoa, and heaven knows what in a syrup. Too much politics in our food threatened to demoralize our large cities. The same thing happened in London in 1868. We survived it, kept on preaching against it, and giving money to prosecute the guilty. It was an age of pursuit. Ministers pursuing ministers, lawyers pursuing lawyers, doctors, merchants, even Arctic explorers pursuing one another, the North Pole a jealous center of interest. Everything is frozen in the Arctic region, save the jealousies of the Arctic explorers. Even the North Pole men were like others. This we discovered in 1884, when in Washington the post-mortem trial of DeLong and his men was in progress. There was nothing to be gained by the controversy. There were no laurels to be awarded by this investigation, because the men whose fame was most involved were dead. It was a quarrel, and the Jeannette was the graveyard in which it took place. It was disgraceful. Jealousy is the rage of a man, also of a woman. It was evident in the progress of this one-sided trial that our legislature needed to have their corridors, their stairways, and their rooms cleaned of lobbyists. At the state capitol in Albany, one bright spring morning in the same year, the legislature rose and shook itself, and the sergeant-at-arms was instructed to drive the squad of lobbyists out of the building. He did it so well that he scarcely gave them time to get their canes or their hats. Some of the lowest men in New York and Brooklyn were among them. That was a spring cleaning worth while. But it was only a little corner of the political arena that was unclean. I remember how eagerly, when I went to Canada in April, the reporters kept asking me who would be the next president. It would have been such an easy thing to answer if I had only known who the man was. In this dilemma, I suggested some of our best presidential timber in Brooklyn as suitable candidates. These were General Slocum, General Woodford, General Tracy, Mayor Lowe, Judge Pratt, Judge Turney, Mr. Stranahan, and Judge Nielsen. Some of these men had been seriously mentioned for the office. Honorable mention was all they got, however. They were too unpretentious for the role. It was the beginning of a mudslinging campaign, New York versus New York, Brooklyn versus Brooklyn. I long ago came to the conclusion that the real heroes of the world were on the sea. The ambitions of men crowded together on land were incontestably disgusting. On the vast, restless deep, men stand alone, in brave conflict with constant danger. I was always deeply impressed by the character of men as revealed in the disasters of the sea. There were many of them during my lifetime. The bigger the ships grew, the more dangerous became ocean travel. Our improvements seemed to add to the humor of grim old Neptune. In 1884, the ocean was becoming a great turnpike road, and people were required by law to keep to the right or to the left. A population of 1 million soldiers was on the sea at all times. Some of the ships were too busy to stop to save human lives, as was the case in the disaster of the Florida. In distress, her captain hailed the city of Rome, a monster of the deep. But the city of Rome had no time to stop, and passed on by. The lifeboats of the Florida were useless shells, utterly unseaworthy. The Florida was unfit for service. John Bain, the engineer, was the hero who lost his life to save others. But this was becoming a common story of the sea. For when the Schiller went down, Captain Thomas gave his life for others. When the Central America sank, President Arthur's father-in-law perished in the same way. Every shipwreck I have known seems lighted up with some marvelous deed of heroism in man. In 1884, there was a failure in Wall Street for $8 or $10 million, and hundreds went down during this shipwreck. By heroism and courage alone were they able to outlive it. To whom did all this money belong? To those who were drowned in the storm of financial sea. But it was only a Wall Street flurry. It did not affect the national ship as it would have done 20 years before. The time had passed when Wall Street could jeopardize the commerce of the country. 20 years before, such a calamity in 3 days' time would have left all the business of the nation in the dust. It would have crashed down all the banks, the insurance companies, the stock houses. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, New Orleans, from coast to coast, everything would have tumbled down. The principal lesson derived from this panic was to keep excitable men out of Wall Street. While the romance of a failure for hundreds of thousands of dollars is more appealing than a failure for a small sum, the greater the deficit, the greater the responsibility. Ferdinand Ward was in this Wall Street crash of 1883. The roseate glasses of wealth through which he saw the world had made him also see millions in every direction. George L. Seney lost his bank and railroad stock in this failure, but he had given hundreds of thousands to the cause of education, North and South. Some people regretted that he had not kept his fortune to keep him out of his trouble. I believe that there were thousands of good people all over the country who prayed that this philanthropist might be restored to wealth. There was one man in Wall Street at this time who I said could not fail. He was Mr. A.S. Hatch, president of the New York Stock Exchange. He had given large sums of money to Christian work and was personally an active church member. That which I hear about men who are unfortunate makes no impression on me. There is always a great jubilee over the downfall of a financier. I like to put the best phase possible on a man's misfortune. No one begrudged the wealth of the rich men of the past. The world was becoming too compressed, it was said. There was not enough room to get away from your troubles. All the better. It was getting to a compactness that could easily be poked up and divinely appropriated. A new cable was landed at Rockport, Mass., that was to bring the world into closer reunion of messages. We were to have cheaper cable service under the management of the Commercial Cable Company. Simultaneously with this information, the SS America made the astounding record of a trip from shore to shore of the Atlantic in 6 days, 14 hours, and 18 minutes. It was a startling symbol of future wonders. I promised then to exchange pulpits with any church in England once a month. It seemed a possibility, as proposed in Mr. Corbin's scheme of harbors on Montauk Point. There were pauses in the breathless speed we were just beginning at this time. We paused to say farewell to the good men whom we were passing by. They were not spectacular. Some of them will no doubt be unknown to the reader. A gentle old man, His face, illumined always by a radiant smile, fell behind. He was Bishop Simpson. We paused to bid him farewell. In 1863, walking the streets of Philadelphia one night with an army surgeon, we passed the Academy of Music in that city, where a meeting was being held on behalf of the Christian Commission, the object of which was to take care of wounded soldiers. As we stood at the back of the stage listening, the meeting seemed to be very dull. A speaker was introduced. His voice was thin, his manner unimpressive. My friend said, "Let's go." But I replied, "Wait until we see what there is in him." Suddenly he grew on us. The address became adorned with a pathos, a sublimity, and an enthusiasm that overwhelmed the audience. When the speaker sat down, I inquired who he was. "That is Bishop Simpson," said my informant. In later years, I learned that the bishop's address that night was the great hour of his life. His reputation became national. He was one of the few old men who knew how to treat young men. He used no gestures on the platform, no climaxes, no dramatic effects of voice. Yet he was eloquent beyond description. His earnestness broke over and broke through all rules of rhetoric. He made his audiences think and feel as he did himself. That, I believe, is the best of a man's inner salvation. In the autumn of the same year, we paused to close the chapters of Jerry Macaulay's life, a man who had risen from the depths of crime and sin, a different sort of man from Bishop Simpson. He was born in the home of a counterfeiter. He became a thief, an outlaw. By an influence that many consider obsolete and old-fashioned, he became converted, and was recognized by the best men and women of New York and Brooklyn. I knew Macaulay. I stood with him on the steps of his mission at Water Street. He was a river thief, changed into an angel. It was supernatural, a miracle. Macaulay gave 12 years to his mission work. 2 years before his death, he changed his quarters, converting a dive into a house of God. What an imbecile city government refused to touch was surrendered to hosannas and doxologies. The story of Jerry Macaulay's missionary work in the heart of a wicked section of New York was called romantic. I attest that I am just as keenly sensitive to the beauty of romance as any human being, but there was a great deal that was called romantic in American life in 1884 to 1885 that was not so. Romance became a roseate mist through which old and young saw the obligations of life but dimly. A strange romance of marriage became epidemic in America at this time. European ethics were being imported, and the romance of European liberty swept over us. A parental despotism was responsible. The newspapers of the summer of 1884 were full of elopements. They were long, exciting chapters of domestic calamity. My sympathies were with the young fellow of $700 income, married to a millionaire fool who continually informed him how much better her position was before she left home. The honeymoon a bliss of 6 months, and all the rest of his life a profound wish that he had never been born. His only redress the divorce court or the almshouse. The poetry of these elopements was false. The prose that came after was the truth. Marriage is an old-fashioned business, and that wedding procession lasts longest that starts not down the ladder out the back window, but from the front door with a benediction. But morally and politically, we were in a riot of opinion which I constantly protested. Politically, we were without morals. The opposing presidential candidates in 1884 were Grover Cleveland and James G. Blaine. It was the wonder of the world that the American people did not make Mr. Blaine president. There was a worldwide amazement also at the abuse which preceded Mr. Cleveland's election. The whole thing was a spectacle of the ignorance of men about great men. All sorts of defamatory reports were spread abroad about them. Men of mind were also men of temperament. There are 2 men in every one man, and for this reason Mr. Blaine was the most misunderstood of great men. To the end of his brilliant life, calumny pursued him. There were all sorts of reports about him. One series of reports said that Mr. Blaine was almost unable to walk, that he was too sick to be seen, that death was for him close at hand, and his obituaries were in type in many of the printing offices. The other series of reports said that Mr. Blaine was vigorous, went up the front steps of his house at a bound, was doing more work than ever, and was rollicking with mirth. The baleful story was ascribed to his enemies, who wanted the great man out of the world. The reassuring story was ascribed to his friends, who wanted to keep him in the ranks of presidential possibilities. The fact is that both reports were true. There were 2 Mr. Blaines, as there are 2 of every mercurial temperament. Of the phlegmatic, slow-pulsed man there is only one. You see him once, and you see him as he always is. Not so with the nervous organization. He has as many moods as the weather, as many changes as the sky. He is bright or dull, serene or tempestuous, cold or hot, up or down, January or August, day or night, Arctic or tropical. At Washington in 1889 I saw the two Blaines within 2 hours. I called with my son to see the great Secretary of State at his office, and although it was his day for seeing foreign diplomats, he received us with great cordiality. His face was an illumination, his voice resonant, his manner animated. He was full of gesticulation. He walked up and down the room describing things under discussion, fire in his eye, spring in his step. Although about 59 years of age, he looked 49, and strong enough to wrestle with 2 or 3 ordinary men. He had enough vitality for an athlete. We parted. My son and I went down the street, made 2 or 3 other calls, and on the way noticed a carriage passing with 2 or 3 people in it. My attention was startled by the appearance in that carriage of what seemed a case of extreme invalidism. The man seemed somewhat bolstered up. My sympathies were immediately aroused, and I said to my son, "Look at that sick man riding yonder." When the carriage came nearer to us, my son said, "That is Mr. Blaine." Looking closely at the carriage, I found that this was so. He had in 2 hours swung from vigor to exhaustion, from the look of a man good for 20 years of successful work to a man who seemed to be taking his last ride. He simply looked as he felt on both occasions. We had seen the 2 Blaines. How much more just we would be in our judgment of men if we realized that a man may be, honestly, 2 different men, and how this theory would explain that which in every man of high organization seems sometimes to be contradictory. Aye, within 5 minutes some of us with mercurial natures can remember to have been 2 entirely different men in 2 entirely different worlds. Something said to us cheering or depressing, some tidings announced, glad or sad, some great kindness done for us, or some meanness practiced on us, have changed the zone, the pulsation, the physiognomy, the physical, the mental, the spiritual condition, and we become no more what we were than summer is winter, or mid-noon is midnight, or frosts are flowers. The air was full of political clamor and strife in the election of 1884. Never in this country was there a greater temptation to political fraud, because after 4 months' battle, the counting of the ballots revealed almost a tie. I urged self-control among men who were angry and men who were bitter. The enemies of Mr. Blaine were not necessarily the friends of Mr. Cleveland. The enemies of Mr. Cleveland were bitter, but they were afraid of Mr. Blaine, for he was a giant, intellectually, practically, physically, and he stood in the center of a national arena of politics, prepared to meet all challenge. Mr. Cleveland never really opposed him. He faced him on party issues, not as an individual antagonist. The excitement was intense during the suspense that followed the counting of the ballots, and Mr. Cleveland went into the White House amid a roar of public opinion so confused and so vicious that there was no certainty of ultimate order in the country. In after years I enjoyed his confidence and friendship, and I learned to appreciate the stability and reserve of his nature. In a milestone beyond this I have recalled a conversation I had with him in the White House, and recorded my impressions of him. Above the clamor of these troublesome times, I raised my voice and said that in the distant years to come the electors of New York, Alabama, Maine, and California would march together down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington for the discharge of the great duties of the Electoral College. The storm passed, and the Democrats were in power. It was the calm that follows an electrical disturbance. The paroxysm of filth and moral death was over. End of section 13.